David, I'm totally old school. I got a paper here. Doug, thank you very much. Thank you all so very much for this invitation. As I listened to you, David, I thought, right. Christians just want to live under the aegis and the burden of something they can't possibly do all the time. I was much more comfortable with the word compassion rather than altruism as well, but I took the Oxford definition, the selfless concern for the well-being of others, as my touchstone. So whether selflessness is actually possible or not is the guilt under which Christians live. So we won't worry about that for the moment. And the first thing is there is this deep Presbyterian confidence that God is bigger than the Presbyterian Church. And actually a confidence that God is bigger than the Christian church. And even larger and able to work beyond the bounds of religion whatsoever. And so, as I thought about this concept, I thought, well, I certainly could draw on, because I know that Christians have been inspired repeatedly to greater intimacy and fidelity with God through traditions beyond our own and even beyond that, where God moves. But you asked me to speak from a Christian point of view, and so I'm going to try to limit myself to sort of a Christian sense of this, of compassion. And the where I would start is with God's compassion. In Exodus, God says to Moses, I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have heard their cry, and I know their sufferings. I would begin with this sense that God feels and has felt something we feel. God has felt our hurt, and so has crossed the boundary in some way between God and us. The second is a very explicitly Christian piece from Paul's letter to the Philippians that's an extension of that same character of God. Philippians 2, Paul writes, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So in the same trajectory, then God relinquishes something of God's identity to again cross the divide between God and us. And then finally, where I want to focus is a parable where Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? And he tells this story. A certain human being was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, was moved with compassion. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 days' wages, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Familiar story. One of the leading Christian ethicists of the last century was Paul Lehmann. And he said that the goal of all Christian ethics was to make and to keep human life human. Now, the parable of Good Samaritan is a call to exactly that same ethical goal. The parable of the Good Samaritan has rightly been called the essence of Christianity. It is a clear narrative about making and keeping human life human. Let me explain. The first word is a certain human being, anthropos, where we get anthropology. It's the most generic word that one could use to describe a human being. Going down this notoriously dangerous road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and this then becomes a parable about what it is to be genuinely human. The human being falls into the hands of robbers who beat him and leave him half dead, and then three people with very specific religious identities come by. Each has a very specific religious identity: priest, Levite, Samaritan. And we would rightly expect, at least in our first glimpse at this, the priest and the Levite to be guided by their religious identity, like the law from Leviticus that's quoted earlier, to love the neighbor or the alien as oneself. The law to compassion was viewed among Jews of the first century to be more important than the ritual law, that it would have been worse to fail in compassion than to become unclean. So, we would expect the Levite and the priest, by virtue of their religious identity, to help this human being. And they did not. So, we have to surmise in some way, so why didn't they? Well, it seems to be their fear of being attacked on this dangerous road that kept them apart. There was a possibility of great hardship for them, fear of harm and loss, and that's what kept them from compassion. And their religion turned out to be of no help in their responding humanly or humanely. And that has certainly been the case for other religious people, including, of course, lots and lots of Christians. Since the suffering human being was a Jew, we would not expect the Samaritan to help, as they were enemies. But some way or another, his religion did not deter him. So what's that about? Compassion overwhelmed his religious identity, or was it the heart of his religious identity? Whatever. That's the surprise in the parable and its point. Douglas John Hall said that this parable is the essence of Christianity. And he added that compassion that crosses religious boundaries is more Christian than anything else. Religion that crosses religious boundaries is more Christian than anything else. The goal of Christian ethics is to make and keep human life human, which seems to require, upon occasion, crossing religious boundaries. So this essential Christian parable is a testimony to the value of human compassion over religion. And as I said, Christians have learned this lesson from Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Hindus again and again. And after looking around, I discovered that every now and then some Christian somewhere also seems to get this. So, here's a story. Fuad Banan was a Christian Arab born in Jerusalem. He was the pastor of a small Christian community in Beirut. His church was in the middle of the overwhelmingly Muslim part of the city, West Beirut. And in '83, when the Israeli army went north, a lot of people in Beirut did not suspect that the city would eventually be cut off and surrounded, but this little congregation somehow surmised that that might happen. So they stockpiled food in Banan's church. And then, when the siege came and the city was cut off and food was starting to dwindle, they had a session meeting. That's the board of the church met together to decide what to do with all this stockpiled food. And they ended up with two propositions on the table. One proposition was that they begin by distributing the food first to the Christians in their community, and then beyond their community, and then finally to their Muslim neighbors. The other alternative was quite the opposite, that they would begin by handing out the food first to their Muslim neighbors, and then to their Christian neighbors, and then finally to the community. This board meeting lasted 6 hours. Religion at work. And about 6 hours in, an older woman, much respected elder in the community, stood up, and in her impatience she said, "You hypocrites, if we do not demonstrate the love of Christ in this place, who will?" And proposal 2 prevailed. They gave the food first to the Muslims, and then to the other Christians, and finally to the members of the congregation. The story of Banan's session's decision is the parable again. It makes compassion the goal of Christianity and not religious identity. In compassion, God felt something that we felt. God felt our hurt, and so crossed the boundary between us and God. God crossed the road and came near. And evidently, God made us that way too. God made us in God's image, able to feel the suffering of others. It is actually only by dehumanizing that we fail to feel another's pain and come near. So God made us this way, human, and intends to keep us that way. You could say that God is the original humanist. In my tradition, we believe even that God became human, and in Christ was fully human, so that we could see what that fully human life looks like. And to these Christian eyes, it looks like the Samaritan, or the Jew, or the Muslim, or the Christian, who feels the pain of another human being by the side of the road and comes near. It is how we were made. May the Holy One grant us all the grace to be what we were made to be. Thank you. Bless you.